Okay. Boker tov lekulam. Welcome back to our students. Lovely to have everyone here this morning. Some returning faces, some new faces. Welcome. Some of my students, specifically students in Ra'anana, mentioned that they had trouble last week getting into the class. So I'm just going to give a really, really short review of what we studied last week before we continue on to our shiur this week. On the chat, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon as chat. If you didn't get the Dafei Mekorot, you can see them on the chat. There are the sources. If you're able to print them up and you'd like to, you could do that as well. Otherwise, you can follow along with us. Thank you to the women who are opening their screens this morning, Boker Tov. And to those who want to keep their cameras off, I respect your privacy, but it is lovely to see you this morning. Hi, Amber, welcome back. Wonderful to see you. Good to be back this morning. So, Chodesh Tov, Efshar Lagi Choref Tov, as we begin to say, Ten Talu Matar Libracha, that's important to note in our tefillah. We are now asking God in earnest for rain. So last week, we opened our course on meaning in mitzvot, and we presented an interesting question. That was, are there really 613 mitzvot? And perhaps to the shock of some of you, gasp, there are not 613 mitzvot. If we would begin to count, we would actually find many more than 613. Probably in the Torah, there are more than 1,000 mitzvot if we would actually begin to count. And I'm not even counting the mitzvot which are given to us by the rabbis. These are just the mitzvot that are written in the Torah shebichtav. In our written Torah, there are many more than 1,000 mitzvot. Where did our rabbis come up with this number of 613? And here there is an interesting source brought to us in the Talmud and also in the Midrash regarding the number 613. See that I'm freezing 1 second. The number 613 is a symbolic number, and according to our rabbis, is made up of two numbers. The number 365, which corresponds to our negative mitzvot, the things that we refrain from doing, right? Mitzvot lo taseh, and the number 248, which corresponds to the positive mitzvot, the things that we do. And these two numbers, as I said, are symbolic numbers. Perhaps the number 365 corresponding to time, to the concept of a year, to how we live our lives in terms of days. And the number 248 corresponding to the limbs of our bodies, how we use our bodies, how we function. Now, again, we said that medical professionals will tell us that the number 248 is not exact. Chazal didn't actually, how they came to the number 248 in terms of limbs of our body. But again, we're not going to pick on that. We're going to understand that these two numbers are representative of things. And then we asked ourselves, why so many? If the number 613 is symbolic, why 613? Why so many? And the verse teaches us, Rabbi Hanania ben Akashia Omer, Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu לזכות את ישראל, לכן הרבה להם תורה ומצוות. Said Nakashia, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to give the Jewish people opportunities to serve him, to get close, to lezakot could also mean to give merit, could also to refine them. And so he gave them more opportunities, 613 opportunities, right? To do positive mitzvot or to refrain from doing mitzvot, all of these ways of refining ourselves. The truth is, we are reminded in Parshat Bereshit that Adam, the first man, had only to do two things. One, lechol mikol atzei hagan, to eat from all the trees, and from one tree to refrain from eating. Two things he had to do, and he screwed up. And therefore, very few opportunities gives us more opportunities actually to fail. But more opportunities gives us better opportunities, in a sense, to come close to God, to serve him. And so, and that's why he gave us so many mitzvot. We also touched on last week this differentiation between a mitzvah kala and a mitzvah chamura, what we would refer to as a light
Want to listen with me?
Or a light mitzvah or an easy mitzvah. Right? Our children today say, oh, it's a kal. That's so easy. It's so light. Or a mitzvah chamura, one which is more difficult or is more severe. And the truth is, we said that we are not allowed to make those differentiations. Although we do often say about a mitzvah that it is a mitzvah kala, when it's easy for us to perform, it doesn't require from us a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, then we say that mitzvah is kala. And the chamura, we look at a mitzvah as a mitzvah which requires from us a tremendous amount of time and effort and perhaps money to put out, that we see as a mitzvah chamura. And actually, we are not supposed to make those differentiations. And in truth, I would even say that it also depends on the person. Some people, for some people, those mitzvot come easily, while to other people, those mitzvot are very difficult. And I also said, if someone was raised observant of mitzvot, certain mitzvot like Shabbat or Kashrut might be very easy to them. They've never known anything else. While someone who came to it at a different stage in life might actually find those mitzvot challenging. Therefore, it's not up to us to decide whether a mitzvah is kala or chamura, easy or not so easy. That's not a determination for us. We're supposed to see all the mitzvot, right, in the same vein. And then we finish by saying that the Torah does not give us the reward for mitzvot. And the reason the Torah does not say, for this mitzvah, you get this reward, and for this mitzvah, this reward, is the analogy of the orchard. If the owner of the orchard would say to the gardeners, these trees are very precious to me, while these I care little about, they would only tend the important trees. And God wants us to tend the entire orchard. If he would give us the reward for certain mitzvot, the nature of man, I'm reminded by those games in the arcade, where people would go for a big score, right? Throw the ball and get the big score, right? The idea here is we don't know the big score with regard to the mitzvot, and therefore Hashem didn't want to give point systems so that we would tend the entire orchard. We would treat all the mitzvot the same. We would not make a differentiation between a mitzvah which has a big score, a big reward, versus a mitzvah that has a little reward. And I mentioned even last week the fascinating example which appears in the Torah, and with regard to two mitzvot that the Torah says, ve'arachta yamim, and you will have a length of days. And these two mitzvot, interestingly enough, one is shiluach haken, to send away the mother bird if you wanted to take the eggs or the chicks. And the other mitzvah that the Torah mentions is honoring our parents. And in my eyes, those two mitzvot represent the complete two opposites of the spectrum. To send away the mother bird, in my eyes, is probably one of the easiest mitzvot, because all it requires is for us to shoo, literally just to go like this, shoo, and the mitzvah is completed. While kibud horim, the honor of our parents, is one of the most difficult mitzvot to do. It's a mitzvah that we are obligated to do throughout our lives, and it doesn't get easier with time. It gets more difficult as our parents become older. So therefore, I think the analogy of showing us that both these mitzvot are rewarded, be'arichut yamim, right? Not to mean that a person will live a long life, but will have a life which has value and meaning, shows us mitzvot which are light and easy, and also mitzvot which are more difficult, are supposed to be seen in our eyes as the same. Today, I want us to look at an interesting debate, and that is even before we delve into our course, actually. And that is, are we even allowed to ask, why do we do a certain mitzvah? And what is the meaning behind it? I mentioned last week, right? My father, alav shalom, who used to say, because I said so. And perhaps that should be enough. Perhaps because I said so has to be the reason why we keep all the mitzvot. And God is our Father. He therefore commanded us. We say this before performing a mitzvah. Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, and what's the key word? Vetzivanu. He commanded us. Therefore, we do it because I said so. And it's not our place even to ask. But I'll be honest with you. So many of my students, and especially young people today, that doesn't cut it because I said so. Perhaps my generation, perhaps I was willing to do things because my father said I said so. But today the young people want to know why. And they're asking. And you know what? Because I said so is not good enough. Just because it was done in the previous generation, and just because this is the way it was done, it doesn't seem to satisfy them. And therefore, I actually think this is a worthwhile question to ask ourselves. Is it better if we understand why we do what we do? Does it help us in our daily lives in terms of kiyum mitzvot, in terms of fulfilling the mitzvot, if we are able to understand the reasons for our actions? Well, I'm not the first to ask that question. This is a question which was debated over the centuries by our chachamim. And today I want to present different opinions with regard to this. Is it right? Is it correct to delve, even to ask or present the question about meeting and mitzvot? I just have to stop for a moment to say hello to Donna Katkas, who's a friend from way back. I won't say, but it's a pleasure to see you this morning. Wow, really, blast from the past. It's lovely to see you this morning.
Thanks. Good to see you too, from Palo Alto days. Yes, that's a long time ago. Palo Alto days.
Yes. The verse in Sefer Tehillim says, Te'amu u're'u ki tov Hashem. Te'amu ve're'u ki tov Hashem literally would mean, taste and see that God is good. Now, of course, that's absurd. Taste and see that God is good. We can't taste and see that God is good. The idea, of course, is Tamu means contemplate, right? Tamei ha-mitzvot means reason, understand, and then you will understand or come to fathom that God is good. But the reason I brought this pasuk from Tehillim is because of the word tam. Isn't it interesting that our rabbis did not use the word siba lemitzvot or any other word to describe meaning in mitzvot, but actually use the word ta'am, which could also mean what? Taste. And we'll go back to that. Judaism does not expect people to be capable of fulfilling the mitzvot without having an appreciation for their depth, for their beauty, for their taste. And so, to understand ta'amei mitzvot is perhaps the best way to appreciate our Jewish way of life. Meaning, the more we understand what we do, the easier, in a sense, it will be to actually keep the mitzvot that we do. Again, I will repeat, and we'll see this over and over again, that our greatest rabbis, of course, put aside the issue that there will be many mitzvot that we will never understand. And even King Solomon, with all of his great wisdom, said, I studied and in depth, I struggled with the ashes of the red heifer, and I never understood it, right? And he was left with this strange quandary of not understanding this mitzvah of why the ashes of the red heifer are specifically what purifies someone who has come in contact with the dead. And so, although I'm hopefully basing an entire course on meaning in mitzvot, we do have to understand from the outset that there will be many mitzvot in which the tam or the meaning or why we do it will never be understood, and we'll leave those in a sense aside. Rav Sadia Gaon was the first to classify mitzvot into two categories, and he divided them like this: mitzvot sichliot, mitzvot with a clear underlying rationale. For example, murder and stealing. Now it's interesting that Rav Sadia Gaon brings those two because just this week we read Parshat Noach, and in the 7 Noachite laws, these two also appear: the prohibition against murder and the prohibition against stealing. And the idea being that all of humanity, right, should understand that these things will lead to complete and utter corruption. And as we saw in terms of the flood, a complete destruction of society, right? Not necessarily with a flood, but the breaking down of the structure of a society. And therefore, these are mitzvot that we would understand. They are sichliot. They make sense in terms of our sechel. And then Reb Sadia Gaon says there are mitzvot shimiot, from the word shamayim. Those we cannot understand, and we can't understand why we were commanded them. For example, and these are the examples he brings, shatnez and the red heifer. The red heifer, I already mentioned, right? The ashes of the red heifer that purify. And shatnez. What is shatnez? The prohibition of wearing a garment that has wool and linen together. And the truth is the Torah doesn't tell us why. And there's fascinating reasons for why these two things should not be mixed. But actually, we don't know. And it's I have to say, it's a strange and obscure mitzvah that a person should not wear these two things together. But we don't have any reason. In effect, however, this clarification of Reb Sadia Gaon is actually a distinction that was already mentioned by our rabbis much before, in that they divided mitzvot into two categories based on a pasuk from the Torah, chukim and mishpatim. The term mishpatim refers to mitzvot that we understand in a sense that they have some type of rationale behind them, and chukim, those mitzvot that elude the human intellect, that we don't understand why. And the mishpatim are said to represent laws that have validity even if they had not been written in the Torah, such as, interesting that he puts here, robbery, incest, and murder. These are mitzvot that we would understand. These are mishpatim. And also chukim, such as the prohibitions of swine flesh, the wearing of garments made of wool and flax, and are decrees of God. Here, interesting that the example is not brought of kara duma, the red heifer, but rather of eating swine's flesh, right? That specifically why in the laws of kashrut, the chazir is not allowed. I think it's interesting that that's the example brought. Interestingly enough, even people who are very far from the observance of kashrut will still say that that's something that they don't eat. I'll tell you something, Israelis, many of them traveling abroad, will eat lots of things, but they won't eat chazir. Something very interesting, how it's come into our national consciousness and awareness in terms of the laws of kashrut, specifically that Yehuda Levi classified the commandments under three different headings. He wrote, there are rational laws. These are sichliot, again, connected to our understanding, our sechel. Nafshiot, those having to do with belief in God, justice and gratitude. That's category number one. Category number two, he calls minhagiot, governmental laws, which are concerned with the functioning and well-being of a society. And these would be mitzvot like setting up a court system, for example. And three, revelation laws, shimiot, again, from the word shamayim, or a better way of referring to them, says Yehuda Levi, elohiyot, given to us directly from God. Their main function is to elevate the Jew to communion with God, whose highest manifestation is prophecy. God alone is capable of determining the revelation laws, which in themselves are neither demanded nor rejected by reason. These are mitzvot. These are laws that we are not even supposed to search for or try to understand why we are commanded to do them. Now, Maimonides, we spoke about the Rambam last week in that he was one of the first that actually listed a number, Reb Sadia Gaon, but then the Rambam, the 613, and enumerated them. If we were to look, the Rambam would be the place where we would look for the listing of the 613 mitzvot. The Rambam says we have to be very clear when we differentiate between chukim and mishpatim, that perhaps if we don't understand the mitzvah, we shouldn't think that it doesn't have a reason. It has a reason. It's just we don't understand the reason. And there is a big distinction. It's important to say, to think that God randomly said, don't wear, right, wool and linen together. No, there's a reason behind shatnez. There's a reason behind the paraduma, but we don't understand it. The Rambam writes, it's illegitimate to distinguish between rational and revelational laws. All the laws set forth in the Torah have a cause. And the Rambam uses the words, tachlit mo'ilah. There is a reason, there is a purpose in them, and follow from God's wisdom. They are not an arbitrary act of his will. In some cases, such as the prohibitions against killing and stealing, their utility is clear, while in others, such as the prohibition against sowing with diverse seeds, this is the law of kilayim, that we are not allowed to mix, not only mix seeds together, but we are not allowed to plant in the same row, for example, different types of seeds, and then perhaps the plant would grow together. Maimonides identifies these commandments as mishpatim and chukim, as we've mentioned already before, but he says there are two overall purposes of the Torah: the welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body. And the welfare of the soul, these laws promote correct opinions for the welfare of the body, and it sets down the norms for guidance of a society and an individual. Says the Rambam, every mitzvah has a tachlit mo'ilah. There is a purpose to everything that we do, whether or not we understand it or not. And he says, to promote opinions, the laws foster two kinds of beliefs: absolute true beliefs, such as the existence and unity of God, and beliefs necessary for the well-being of the state, such as God's anger in punishing evildoers, the idea of sachar va'onesh. But says the Rambam, every single mitzvah has a to'elet, has a reason for why we do it, whether or not we understand it or not. Let's put that aside. But every mitzvah we do has a reason behind why we do it. But we also have to wrap our heads around the fact that perhaps not all the mitzvot will we understand, but that doesn't mean that we can discard it, or we can say there is no reason. There is a reason, we just don't understand it. Now, the question about whether or not it is permissible to find a reason for the mitzvot is an actual fascinating debate, which has gone, as I mentioned, gone on for centuries. And the Chachamim actually debate whether or not we are allowed to. Whether indeed, perhaps, the highest level is, I think, what we would call today blind faith. And therefore, if God commanded us, then we should do it, as he said, and we shouldn't be asking too many questions. If he said to do it, asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, then we should be doing it, and we shouldn't be asking too many questions. But there are others who say, there are certain things we are allowed to ask, certain things we are allowed to delve into, and other things we are not. One of them is Rashi. Rashi distinguishes between certain things which are supposed to remain concealed and some things which we are supposed to be actually digging and finding out and searching for. Rashi says, the honor of God is to conceal a matter. For instance, the account of the Merkava and the account of creation, there are certain things, says Rashi, written in the Torah that are written in a hidden fashion. They are not meant for us to understand exactly as they are written. They are on a very, very high, obscure level. The two things he mentions are the account of creation and the Merkava, the chariot that is described in Yechezkel, in Ezekiel, with God's throne and the animals and all of those interesting visual things. What does he mean by Maaseh Bereshit? When the Torah opens with the words, right? And the world was tohu vavohu. What does that mean? Well, I'm not sure. I'll be honest. And many people don't know. I'm not the only one who is confused by the term tohu vavohu. And actually, many of our great commentators give very interesting and fascinating explanations as to what that term means. But indeed, says Rashi, some of those things were meant to be left hidden from us. These are things that we may or may not ever understand, these concepts, and they're supposed to stay hidden. This he calls the honor of God. Whereas, Rashi differentiates, the honor of kings is to search out a matter. When you expound on the honor of the sages and on the safeguards that they enacted to the Torah and on the decrees that they decreed upon them, you should search and seek and ask the reasons for the matters. Says Rashi, different from Maseh Breshit, Maseh Merkava, the things which the rabbis, which the sages enacted. Here, we actually have an obligation to search and seek and ask and understand why we do what we do. This is important. When you expound on the accounts of the Merkava, or on the accounts of creation, or on the statutes written in the Torah, like the statutes and things that the Satan denounces and refutes, such as eating pork, mingled species in a vineyard, and shatnez, you should not search. Says Rashi, chukim, things which are set aside, we are not supposed to understand, leave it as things we don't understand. These are not supposed to be searched. This is what the king has decreed. On the other hand, right, this is the king's decree. On the other hand, things which were instituted by the rabbis, things which are Torah shebe'al peh, we are supposed to ask, we are supposed to search, we are supposed to look for answers and for meaning. Rabbi Yehuda Levi writes something very interesting. He actually says, one who fully accepts the mitzvot without intellectually contemplating is on a greater level than one who contemplates the reasons for mitzvot. I think today, perhaps we would call it blind faith. The idea that a person accepts the mitzvot because they were given by God and therefore we do them is on a higher level than a person who contemplates the reasons. But he says, nonetheless, for one who is no longer at this lofty level, perhaps that's me, because I ask a lot of questions and has been drawn after logic, it's better to find wisdom in the mitzvot than to think poorly of the commandments and cause spiritual destruction. Says Yehuda Levi, if you don't ask and you're not reviewing or asking or searching or trying to understand the reason behind what you do, there is a danger. The danger is that you might take the mitzvot lightly. As a matter of fact, you could actually go further than just taking the mitzvot lightly. You could say they don't apply today. They have no significance today in a modern world, or even, lest I say, go to the extreme and say shtuyot. All of this is shtuyot. It's bomba-mindses. It all applied to a generation in the ancient world, but it doesn't apply to us today in a modern place. The mitzvot have no place today. Says Yehuda Levi, if it would take you along that path that you might come to take the mitzvot lightly, then by all means, right, it's better to find wisdom in the mitzvot, because then it will encourage you to keep them, to do them, if it's important for you to understand why you do what you do. The Rambam says it's appropriate for a person to meditate on the judgments of the Holy Torah and know their ultimate purpose according to his capacity. He says each person according to their own understanding. If he cannot find a reason or a motivating rationale for a practice, he should not regard it lightly. Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it should be disregarded, nor should he break through to assent to God, lest God burst forth against him. Meaning, sometimes we say, many people, this is what God meant. Says the Rambam, we are not allowed to go and put ourselves in his place and say, this is what God meant. That's not our place. He says, one's thoughts concerning them should not be like his thoughts concerning other ordinary matters. See how severe the Torah rules concerning misappropriating sacred properties. Interesting that this entire discussion that the Rambam puts on Tamei Mitzvot, he puts it in Hilchot Me'ilah, and he explains, wood, stone, earth, and ash become holy because the name of the Lord has been called upon them through speech, and anyone who treats them like ordinary articles violates the prohibition against Me'ilah, even if he acted unknowingly. What is this? What is the Rambam talking about? He says, certain things are given status, they become holy, because the name of God has been called, right, as they've been appropriated, for example, for temple service, and therefore they have a special status. And then he says, how much more so, right, the mitzvot which God ordained for us, should a person not treat them derisively because he doesn't understand their rationale? And so we see an interesting theme throughout the rabbis in different generations. The fear is that perhaps if we don't understand, we might dismiss the mitzvot. That's one danger. And the other danger, of course, is that we might think of them lightly. Because we don't understand it, well, we're so intelligent, human beings. We're so advanced. If we don't understand it, then it must be what? Again, I am using that word, shtuyot. It must be absurd. It must not have any rationale behind it. And here we see over and over again that our rabbis say, be very careful not to go down that path. Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning, it doesn't have toilet. I think it's also a lesson in humility. For a man to understand that God has commanded certain things that we don't understand, and we are limited in our understanding, and we also have to accept that. I think this pandemic has taught us as well that man's tremendous, thinking that he is in control of the world and knows so much, we've suddenly become very small. And therefore, here's a lesson in humility. Just because you don't understand doesn't mean, right? Doesn't mean that the mitzvah as it is and presented to us in the Torah doesn't have importance and doesn't have validity. The Torah says, "Ushmartem et kol chukotai v'et kol mishpatai v'asitem otam," and you should guard all my decrees and all my judgments and perform them. Now, the Rambam makes an interesting differentiation. Usually we translate ushmartem, right, as to do, but actually the word lishmo means to guard, right? Guard it. We actually say shamo at Yom HaShabbat. It means guard, safeguard. A shomer is a watchman. And so, ushmartem et kol chukotai v'et kol mishpatai v'asitem otam, that's the doing. He says we are told to guard and perform both the decrees and the judgments. That means the things that we understand and also the things that we don't understand. We have to do them, but we also have to guard them. We also have to watch over them. We have to keep them. We are not allowed to say, right, they are irrelevant. The judgments are those mitzvot that their motivating rationale is revealed to us and we understand, like robbery, bloodshed. And here, says the Rambam, honoring one's mother and father. The Rambam says, isn't that interesting, that even if the Torah had not written it, perhaps that's something that we would come to understand, but he definitely says, kibud hovim, the honoring of parents, is one of the mishpatim that we understand the rationale. That if somebody changed my diaper, my nappy, and got up for me in the middle of the night, I have an obligation to what? To show them respect, right? For the fact that they gave me life and they took care of me, right, during my childhood. The decrees are the mitzvot whose motivating rationales we don't know. And our sages said, I ordain decrees and you have no license to question them. A person's natural inclination confronts him concerning them, and the nations of the world challenge them. And he says the Rambam, that actually the chukim are more difficult than the mishpatim, because when the nations of the world challenge us and say, why do you do it? Our answer actually has to be what? We don't know. We do them because God, right, commanded us to do it. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge specifically when the nations of the world look at us and say, well, that makes no sense. And you want to be able to say, no, there's a reason, there's a rationale, right? But he says, this is also a challenge in Judaism, to accept upon ourselves chukim that we don't understand why we do them. And what is the Rambam list here? The prohibition of the meat of a pig. Going back to, again, kashrut and chazil. There is no rationale in the Torah why this animal is kosher and this one not. Of course, our rabbis have all kinds of ideas, but indeed, the Torah singles out the chazir as having one of the kosher signs, but not both. And therefore, the chazir is not kasher, but the chazir gets singled out. Milk and meat, the calf whose neck is broken, egla arufa, that very, very strange ceremony, which takes place when a person is found dead along the way and they don't know who was the murderer and who is responsible, and this very strange ceremony which takes place in which the elders of the city come out and break a heifer's neck and they say, Yadenu lo shafchu et adam hazeh. Also this tekes, this ceremony we don't understand, the red heifer. And here the Rambam adds something else. the goat sent to Azazel. Also, that interesting thing that we do on Yom Kippur, in which the Kohen HaGadol, right, says over the sins of the Jewish people, places his hands on this goat, and then this goat is sent, right, off of the cliff. He says, also, Seir LaAzazel is something we don't fully understand. It is begeder chukim, and therefore, leave it. Leave it. There are certain things we don't understand. Now, the Ramban Nachmanides, who almost always disagrees, right, with Maimonides, says, when our sages say that chukim are kingly decrees without reason, they did not mean that chukim are arbitrary and reasonless commands from God, as all of God's words are refined. And the Rambam said something similar. Just because we don't understand them, right, when our Chachamim say chukim are kingly decrees without reason, they didn't mean without reason, meaning without rationale. They meant we don't understand it. There is a reason, but the reason we have to do it is because God commanded. Chukim are similar to kingly laws decreed without revealing their reasons. People do not overly benefit from these laws, but rather think cynically of them and accept them out of fear of the kingdom. There are certain laws we need to keep, whether we understand them or not, and part of it, or the motivation, is fear of the king, out of yirah. Whether I understand it or not, I'm obligated to keep it. Similarly, reasons for chukim are secrets of the Torah, and people do not understand them in the same way as mishpatim. Here, the Ramban adds a different word, secrets. Perhaps it's meant to stay hidden. There is a certain sod behind it, and it's meant to stay that way, which I think is interesting that he adds the element of secret, because King Solomon was known to be the wisest of all men. And maybe this is not the place of chokhmah. This is the place of sod. Perhaps it's meant to be kept away, right? The minute a secret is told, it's no longer a secret. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's supposed to be hidden away. And people do not understand them in the same way as mishpatim. The chukim certainly have a good reason, and they also provide benefit for us, but we leave them in the realm of hidden. We don't understand, or we don't know, or perhaps, to be more accurate in the words of the Ramban, he would say, the reason is not revealed to us. That would be using his words in terms of secrets. There is a reason, there is a rationale, and there is benefit to it as well, but it's not revealed to us. It's supposed to be in the realm of secret, hidden away. The Meiri, who is a commentator on the Gemara, his commentary is called the Bet HaBchira, writes, one who has the opportunity to learn Torah and perform a mitzvah should prioritize the mitzvah. This is just an interesting thing on the side. Meaning, if a person comes in conflict between two things, one, a mitzvah which needs to be done, and the learning or studying of Torah, which should he prioritize? He should prioritize the mitzvah if it cannot be performed later. Why? What's the issue? That the mitzvah could be missed, right? If you don't do it now, either the time for it will have passed, or if it's a mitzvah between man and fellow man, right? Mitzvah ben adam lechavero, there is another option, and that is, if you don't prioritize it, either the help will no longer be needed, or the help will be done by someone else. And then the mitzvah was fulfilled, but not by you, right? And here in modern Hebrew, we use the term lehachmitz, right? Lehachmitz means to miss out on an opportunity, which comes from the word chametz, right? Which is what? What is chametz? Chametz is time. The difference between matzah and chametz is a moment. It's a vega, right? Meaning when we wait. So if there's a mitzvah and the study of Torah, he says, first you should perform the mitzvah. However, if the mitzvah could be performed later, if one needs to learn Torah, one must prioritize learning Torah, since Torah enhances the halachic performance, and mitzvot are more beautiful when performed by one who understands them. How wonderful is that? Says it should be done later. later. More beautiful when they are value in studying the meaning behind mitzvot, because the mitzvot are more beautiful when the person who does them, right, does them with understanding. And now he's added another element which we haven't mentioned last week or this week up to now, and that is the element of kavanah, of intent, or maybe understanding. Perhaps that's very important. Mitzvot einam tzrichot kavanah. Mitzvot don't need intent, but they're so much more meaningful when there is intent, kavanah. Are people able to hear? Because I understand that there's some problems with the sound. Just give me a thumbs if you can hear. Everybody's okay? Okay. Rabbi Yitzchak Rama, in his commentary, the Akedat Yitzchak says, the wise individual who contemplates mitzvot in a way we enumerated will always find benefit and religious invigoration for all times, regardless of whether the mitzvah can practically be performed or not. This is an interesting idea. The idea is, should we learn and should we study about mitzvot which are not relevant today? I mentioned this last week, right? I mentioned mitzvot which are not relevant today because they have to do with the temple service, they have to do with sacrifices, and therefore these mitzvot have no relevance today. Should we still learn them? Should we still know about them? And he says, for example, everything written about the Mishkan and the menorah is still relevant today. Similarly, one who understands the lesson behind mitzvot will benefit even if that particular mitzvah is not at hand. And look at the interesting example that he brings. He says, when one understands the mitzvah of assisting a foe's donkey, and that is to completely remove hatred from one's heart, what's the reference that the Rabbi Yitzchak Rama makes? The Torah brings a fascinating mitzvah, which is, if you see chamor sonecha rovetz tachat mas'o, the donkey of your enemy is overloaded, you have an obligation to reach out and help to unload the donkey because the donkey didn't do anything to you, right? The idea is that I see the burden of the animal, and I'm able to separate my feelings towards this person and understand that there is a concept in Judaism, which is what? Tsar Balei Chayim, way before, this is something we should talk about in upcoming shiurim, way before there was Tnu L'Chayot Lichyot, way before, Torah Judaism came and said, animals need to be protected. They need to be taken care of. Even on Shabbat, right? Be'emtecha, we hear about rest for animals. This is a Torah concept way before the modern world understood it. And here, the idea that the animal is suffering means that I have to reach out and help and unload the donkey. But says Rabbi Yitzchak Rama, fascinating that the Torah uses the word sonecha. It's not anyone's donkey. It happens to be the donkey of my soneh, which means that the Torah recognizes whether it's nice or not nice, that a person might have someone in this world that they consider their soneh, their enemy, right? A person that you really don't get along with, that you had as the South Africans like to say, a faribble with, a serious issue, right? And therefore, everything in your mind and everything in your heart says, cross the street. You don't want to have anything to do with this person. Says Rabbi Yitzchak Rama, the Torah forces you to go over and help the donkey, but by doing so, it removes hatred from your heart. Why? Because, of course, you're removing the load from the donkey, but you can't ignore the owner of the donkey who happens to be standing there as well. And perhaps the owner of the donkey, when he sees that you have come over to help, perhaps this will create a bond between you. Perhaps you'll be able to speak about what happened, and you'll be able to get past your animosity and your differences. So, says Rabbi Yitzchak Rama, if you understand that the purpose of this mitzvah, the load on the donkey is actually secondary, it is to remove hatred from your heart, then you can function in accordance with this idea, regardless of whether you encounter a donkey or not. A person could then say, this mitzvah only applies, one, if I see a donkey who happens to be overloaded and I happen to see a donkey who happens to be the donkey of my soneh, then this mitzvah applies. Says Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, the application of the mitzvah has validity, has something to teach us in our everyday life. And his example of the menorah and his example of the Mishkan are the same. Even though these mitzvot don't apply to us today, there is so much to learn from them in terms of the way we lead our lives, and therefore we should continue to learn about them. And although we don't practice them, we should definitely ask, why are they done in a certain way? Why do we do them? Just think the two examples that he brought, the Mishkan. Think about the fact that the Mishkan was built from donations of people. Kol asher yidveno libo. The concept of doing something with what? With a full heart, with volunteering. The concept of volunteerism. That's a beautiful concept to take away from the Mishkan, even if the Mishkan itself doesn't apply today. And the same with the lighting of the menorah. Think about how many lessons we can take into our own life. First of all, that the Kohen cleans the ashes, cleans the candles every day himself. The fact that we don't let the fire go out. Just think about that concept, that there is constant lighting of light, right? Trust me, God doesn't need light. The Mishkan doesn't need light. It's a concept of bringing light and lighting, making sure that the candles are lit. So many lessons we can take to our daily lives, even if these specific mitzvot are not relevant to us today. Reb Chaim of Volozhin says, the deep secret understanding behind mitzvot, which God gives to some individuals, are to prompt and to contemplate to the best of one's abilities the full impact of each mitzvah, of each action, word and thought a person performs. For this realization of the power of mitzvot, one should be inspired to perform every mitzvah in the most optimal fashion. I think that's an interesting word, in the most optimal fashion. And if, for me, it's important to understand why we do it in this specific way. Why did Chazal say we should do like this and not like this? Why to say this word and not this word? Why to hold it in this hand and not this hand? If this is important to me, because it will help me to fulfill the mitzvah in optimal fashion, right, in the best way possible, then I should. And I should also have awe and love of God, holiness and purity of heart. Performing mitzvot in this way has a greater effect than performing them without holiness and purity of intention. So here he mentions the concept of kavanah, that when I am able to add intent, kavanah, to what it is I'm doing, it raises the level to a completely different, it raises the mitzvah to a completely different level when I understand the kavanot, when I can think about why I'm doing what I am doing. Nonetheless, and he says, this is a very important point. I underlined it for myself on the sheet. Nonetheless, the necessary component of a mitzvah observance is actual physical action of the mitzvah. Shelo nishkash lerega. Let us not forget at all that we can contemplate and study and think all we want, but we actually have to do it. A mitzvah is not completed and it's not done unless it's done. We can have all the good thoughts in the world. We can have all of the study, but a mitzvah needs to be done. He says, let's not forget it. In all of our wonderful searching and studying and wanting to understand, mitzvot have to be done. We are a religion of action. That's what we are, right? We'll mention in a moment the concept of na'aseh v'nishma, that we do. That's what we do. First, we do. That's a very important element of Judaism. One of the biggest differences between Christianity and Judaism is that we are a religion of deed and not creed. You have to do, and anyone who's had any experience with a person who was converting to Judaism, besides all of the study, which they do, they are required to perform mitzvot, right? In other words, the only way to learn is to practice. And that's true. You can study and study and study, but then you really learn how to do it by doing it. That's the truth. I often said to my kids, right, you could read every cookbook in the world, and that doesn't mean you know how to cook. That's the truth, right? And the same is true, and you probably would agree with me that we didn't actually learn how to drive until we actually were driving, right? Many things are actually learned through the practice of doing. So here we understand, says Reb Chaim of Volozhin, lo lishkoach, do not forget, It's important to study, it's important to learn. But actually, right, the doing is of prime importance. The Rebbe of Gur, in his work, the Sfat Emet, writes, the Midrash says chukim and laws which the non-Jewish nations taunt us with by sarcastically asking what is the reason for this commandment, says this is our challenge. The non-Jews actually taunt us and they say, why do you do this? And you don't have a good answer. He says, I wrote elsewhere that this Midrash implies that chukim have reasons, but these reasons cannot be revealed in this world because these reasons are too spiritual to manifest in this physical world. He says, unlike the Ramban who says that they are hidden, he says they have reasons, but they can't be revealed because they are very, very spiritual and they don't have a place in this physical world. As such, Moshe Rabbeinu, who transcended nature, understood the red heifer. How did Moshe Rabbeinu understand the red heifer? Well, Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai 40 days and 40 nights, and he didn't eat and he didn't drink. He was on a completely different plane. He was in a non-physical, in essential place. In actuality, though, simply and humbly observing commandments without knowing the reasons, one will subsequently gain clarity in the reasons. This is the meaning of when the Jewish people said, Na'aseh v'nishma. Through doing them, we will understand them. We will come to understand them. He says something fascinating, and this is again a well-known principle. Lo lishma, balishma. Sometimes when we perform a mitzvah, through the performance of the mitzvah, we come to understand the meaning or the reason for it, but only through the doing. And he says the learning is very important, but the doing is actually extremely important. And therefore, sometimes the understanding, right, the nishma, comes through the naaseh. And there's a famous midrash that says that the non-Jews came to the Jewish people and they said, Am pziza atem. You are a nation that are pzizim. You don't think things through, right? You said naaseh v'nishma, and you didn't ask to hear what was written, right? You bought it and you didn't ask, no questions. You just took the Torah without asking questions. Says here, the Sfat Emet, it's not, Naaseh v'nishma means we want to understand. How will we come to the understanding? Through the Naaseh. By doing it, then we come to understand. And he says, actually, at the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people were on a very high level. How do we know the Jewish people were on such a high level? It says, Va'u et hakolot, right? They were able to see sounds. He actually says at Har Sinai, when the Jewish people said, Na'aseh v'nishma, they completely understood what it is they were saying. Things were clear to them. But after the sin of the golden calf, we lost this level. And the reasons for the commandments, and this is actually what the non-Jewish nations taunt us about. However, through keeping the commandments without knowing the reasons, we will be able to understand their reasons. He says, as I said, lo lishma, even if at first we don't understand, as we do them, then the mitzvot take on a tremendous amount of meaning as we do them. I think that this is true, most of us would agree, in the education of our children. We don't want to begin to educate them in Torah mitzvot at the age of 12 or 13. Imagine coming to a young girl on the day of her 12th birthday, or to a young man on the day he turns 13, and begin to explain to them what it is to keep mitzvot. I tell my bat mitzvah students, do you know what? All these years you've been practicing. That's what I say to them. That's what you've been doing. And your parents were very clever to help you practice. It's true that now you have an obligation, chiyuv mitzvot, but look how wonderful it is that you've been practicing. It makes it so much easier, the transition between a person who's lo mechuyav to mechuyav, a person who's not obligated to obligated, because you've been practicing. The idea of doing the mitzvot all of this time, even if you fully didn't understand what you were doing, right, makes it easier. First of all, to accept mitzvot, the ol mitzvot, the obligation of mitzvot makes it easier, but also it helps you then work on the understanding of what it is you're doing. I would just add on a personal note, sometimes we get stuck though. And this is why I think a course like this is very important. We get stuck doing things because this is the way it's always been done, or this is the way we were taught, and we don't go one step further. We get stuck. This is the way we've been taught, right? And therefore, limud, the study, is always a good thing in terms of learning and growing, and actually, in a sense, keeping our mitzvot observance fresh and exciting. Rav Soloveitchik, in his book Reflections of the Rav, Man of Faith in the Modern World, makes a very interesting distinction. Rav Soloveitchik writes, asking why God issued certain commandments is seeking to comprehend the unfathomable. In contrast to the question why is the question what. What inquires about the meaningfulness of particular mitzvah to the individual and to society. This is a legitimate pursuit. Says Rav Soloveitchik, such an important distinction. We shouldn't ask why, but we should ask what. What is the meaning? How can this mitzvah become relevant to me? It might be even meritorious to inquire, how can I integrate and assimilate this mitzvah into my religious consciousness and outlook? What thoughts and emotions should I feel when the Paraduma chapter is read in the synagogue? How can it help me achieve dvekut, a greater closeness to God? I thought that question was so beautiful, because sometimes we do come to that parsha in the Torah and we say, oh boy, really? Do we have to even read this? It's so strange. It's so obscure. It has no relevance to my life. Says Rav Soloveitchik, no, let that be our challenge, right? Even if we don't understand it, perhaps we can ask, right? How can studying this help me in my personal life? How can I make it relevant? I want to end, as we're coming close to the end, to the last source on the page. Rav Moshe Shapiro once asked Rav Eliyahu Dessler, and he asked him, how could you explain the term ta'amei hamitzvot, right? The reasons for the commandments. And Rav Dessler answered, the ta'am of a mitzvah is the geschmack, is the geschmack. It's the taste of a mitzvah. Rav Dessler translated the word ta'am literally as taste. And he explained that although we eat food in order to survive, we nevertheless enjoy its variety, its taste, its texture as a pleasant side effect of eating. I'm reminded by people of Chas v'Shalom who have been sick with corona, who can't smell and taste, how the pleasure of eating has been taken away from them, because so much of what we enjoy in food is smell and taste. And therefore, he says, God made the mitzvot with a variety of tastes, and we fulfill the mitzvot because they are the will of God, and they are instructions for living. But investing in mitzvot also pays other dividends. When we explain the Tamei mitzvot, we get geschmack, we get a taste, and it's so lovely and special. When we engage in mitzvot in this way, and we have a good tam in our mouth, right? Then it's so much easier to fulfill the mitzvot. He says the act of a mitzvah also involves our heart and our mind. And so when we explain ta'amei mitzvot, we understand that the Torah is also teaching us about certain values. That what do we value in Torah? We value kindness, we value giving, we value wisdom. And so the mitzvot have so much to teach us in terms of our everyday life. And so knowledge of the rationale of the mitzvot is important. It shapes our mitzvah observance. And one who fulfills the mitzvah in a dry, mechanical way, without any geschmack, without any taste, has indeed fulfilled the mitzvot, but he doesn't rejoice. He doesn't have any joy from it. I think about the fact that you are eating without tasting or without smelling. It takes away the pleasure of it. So he says there are certain mitzvot perhaps that we are not supposed to understand, but there's so many other mitzvot that perhaps the tam, right, helps us so much to fulfill the mitzvah with a good taste, so that it really comes into our heart, through our minds, goes into our hearts. And so the investigation of the reasons for the mitzvot is definitely fulfilled through the study of Torah. The more we study and the more we understand, right, it actually helps our observance of mitzvot. And it helps us in so many ways. we said the purpose of mitzvot is the action, but when we understand why we do what we do, right, it helps us to fulfill or complete the action in a better or more complete way, adding kavanah and intent, and giving us such a nice taste in our mouth, right? Such a nice tam, geschmack, right? When we do it, bringing our mitzvah observance, hopefully, to a better or to a different level completely, when we are able to, right, better understand why we do what we do or how we do it, or better yet, I like Rav Soloveitchik's distinction so much. Instead of asking why, what? What about the mitzvah, right? How can I enhance it in a different way? And perhaps we're supposed to leave certain things as to why we're supposed to leave it, right, to a different place and say, Hashem commanded, it's not for us to understand, but there are many things that we can discuss and delve into. And therefore, that's our introduction to the course. I hope that in the coming weeks, that's what we'll do. We'll take certain mitzvot and hopefully through really understanding them in depth, it will indeed enhance our Torah observance. The purpose of study is to do. That's it. In other words, we don't study just for the sake of study. We study in order to be able to perform, to be able to do our mitzvot in a better and more complete way. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. I'm pleased if anyone would like to make a comment or add something, or if you have a question, please feel free to open your microphones. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Gina. It was great.
Thank you, everyone. For those of you who would like to receive the sheets from last week's shiur on our introduction to 613 mitzvot, I will send it again to Matan so that you can print those sheets if you'd like. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov. Keep healthy, keep safe. Hope to see you next Monday. Shavua Tov lekulam. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Gina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, Susan.